They said she would never fit in. They said she was too quiet, too small, too different. They said a girl from a neighborhood where the streetlights buzzed and the sidewalks remembered other people's footsteps had no place on the polished stage of Pinecrest Preparatory. The principal made a joke about it in the faculty lounge one rainy Thursday, laughing like the world was a private club and she had not been invited. "If she plays piano, I quit," he said, the words sharp and quick, half a dare and half a shrug. Everyone around him laughed because that is what people do when they think something impossible is being proposed. Laughter was easier than curiosity. Laughter, after all, costs nothing. Her name was Amaya. She had fingers that could knead the air into sentences and eyes that learned to measure the world by listening. Amaya grew up in an apartment above a laundromat where the smell of clean shirts mixed with the promise that someone would always come back for what they lost. Her mother worked double shifts and smiled in a way that kept hope tucked under her ribs. Amaya learned to pay attention to small mercies, the exact tone a neighbor used when they needed help, the cadence of a bus as it sighed to a stop, the way rain on a tin roof sounded like distant applause. She learned to listen the way children learn to read, patient and persistent. The piano arrived in Pinecrest's atrium like a rumor. It was an old Steinway, lacquer dulled by years of formal recitals and hands that never got messy. Someone donated it with an envelope that smelled faintly of lemon oil. The teachers admired it, the parents smiled for photographs beside it, and the students posed like statues around its polished body. The principal ran his hand along the wood and thought about violinists and conservatory pipelines and scholarships that looked good on brochures. He did not imagine the laundromat's late hours, or the girl who listened to engines and made melodies out of broken sounds. Amaya noticed the piano because she always noticed things that were unremarkable to others. She pressed her hand to the cool wood one afternoon when the rain made the school smell like wet cement and the cafeteria hummed with the safe noise of teenagers. Her touch woke a small dust motes ballet and a tone that was not yet a song. A janitor watched from the stairwell and smiled like he understood something he had not been allowed to speak about, like many people who have seen quiet miracles in empty rooms. She practiced in secret at first. Late nights when the building slept and the security lights painted the hallways the color of old photographs, she would slip in and sit on the bench. Her fingers were small, and the keys felt like strangers, but strangers can become friends if you are patient. She learned scales the way someone learns to read the faces of neighbors, slowly, with loyalty. She listened to street musicians in her head and translated their rhythms into chord progressions. Sometimes she improvised a riff that sounded like the clatter of coins on a tin roof, and sometimes she played lullabies she imagined her mother humming between shifts. Word drifted, as it always does, like steam from a kettle. A janitor mentioned a shadow of a girl who played after hours. A music teacher forgot to lock the practice room one afternoon and found sheet music with annotations in the margins, a shorthand language that said I was here. Gossip is greedy, it elbows into every space. The principal heard the rumor and laughed because his laugh was a shelter. He made the comment in a meeting where parents lined up like farmland, each one waiting for their child's turn to be praised. It was a school assembly that changed the angle of everything. Pinecrest had a charity showcase every year, the kind of event that feeds brochures and forgets the people who make it possible. Students performed, parents applauded, and the principal stood with a ribbon of duties wound around his wrist. Someone announced a surprise piece, and they meant literal surprise, the kind that arrives without rehearsal. Amaya's name was called not because she had been voted the best or the loudest, but because the head of the music department felt an odd pull. He had seen her name on the practice room sign-in once and heard, through the walls, a melody that would not easily be forgotten. She walked to the stage like a question, barefoot inside patent leather shoes she had borrowed from a closet and folded into courage. The auditorium breathed around her. Cameras that usually practiced smiling for prom night now angled to learn what a single person could do to a room. The principal sat with his wallet of opinions, the smile that flattened towns into tidy lines. He did not know her. He could not have known the geography of her life, the laundromat's humming pipes, the neighbor who taught her the blues on a battered guitar, the way she learned to time chords to the rhythm of the city. Her first note was not dramatic. It was an honest pebble dropped into a pond, small and round and causing ripples that widened with no hurry. People shifted their weight in their seats. The principal's laughter was a far memory. She played a sequence that felt like a remembering, a melody that carried the tenderness of someone who had been listening for a long time. The chords she chose were full of space, the kind of space that lets a life breathe. For an hour that might have been 10 minutes, perhaps longer, Amaya filled the room with music that felt like sunlight folding itself into pages. The thing about music is that it does not need permission. It rolls over barriers like tide water, and anyone in its path finds themselves rearranged. Amaya played songs that borrowed from gospel harmonies and old jazz turns, phrases she had overheard on buses and in kitchens. She added trills that sounded like laughter and rests that tasted like apology. She made the keys tell stories, about a woman who worked double shifts and knew how to press patience into a paycheck, about a boy who used to finger the frames of mannequins and count the years between hope and action. She turned ordinary moments into something holy. The faculty watched their assumptions unspool. Parents realized that the scholarships they read about included a currency they had not noticed before: courage. The auditorium filled with an odd, heavy hush that felt like reverence and longing braided together. The principal sat very still. His hands, so used to folding policy into neat packets, trembled a little. It is easy to laugh when you have not yet been taught to listen. It is harder to laugh when something you thought impossible is seated in front of you and is making the building sing. When the last note fell, it was not the dramatic halt of a stage trick. It was a settling, like someone putting a heavy book back on a shelf and closing it properly. People rose to their feet. They stood and clapped in waves, small at first, then swelling into a tide that made the chandeliers shimmer. The principal stood too because he had no choice. He had said something cruel in jest, and the room had rearranged itself around the truth of Amaya's hands. There was a moment, a slice of time where the principal's face moved from amusement to something softer, a recognition that he had been wrong. After the assembly, parents lingered in clusters, voices braided with, "Did you hear that? And where did she learn to play like that?" Amaya moved through them like a comet. They admired her light without knowing the orbit that guided it. Students who had mocked before found themselves extending congratulations with hands that were suddenly softer. The music teacher received bouquets and emails and offers for recommendations. The principal received a quiet note from the superintendent suggesting a public acknowledgement and perhaps a feature on the school's newsletter. But the story never fit neatly into a press release, and Amaya was not interested in press releases. She wanted practice rooms that did not close at 5 and scholarships that would cover more than just tuition. She wanted a piano tuner who could visit the neighborhood and teach others what she had learned by trial and repetition. More than anything, she wanted the principal to understand that laughter, especially laughter that dismisses, was a thing that could be repaired by listening, and that sometimes a joke becomes a cheap excuse to ignore talent. There were challenges that did not make headlines. Funding committees convened with polite smiles. Paperwork arrived with columns of figures that insisted on austerity. A donor offered a scholarship with strings the size of expectations. Amaya considered them like a child might consider an ornate gift, beautiful but heavy. The neighborhood wondered what would happen if their brightest prodigy were whisked into a world that favored image over depth. People debated in barbershops and cafes about whether success meant leaving or bringing others along. It was messy, as change often is. Amaya kept practicing. She began to teach younger kids in the laundromat's backroom, where the smell of detergent mixed with the sharp perfume of ambition. Children gathered on mismatched chairs and listened like they were absorbing light. She taught them scales and timing and how to find a melody hiding in the ordinary. She taught them to make music not because it would make them famous but because music remembered people who had been overlooked. Her students learned to listen to the spaces between notes, to hear when a song needed to breathe and when it needed to rise. The principal did not quit. He sat with his conscience and the public relations team and did something that was rarer than resignation. He learned. He visited the laundromat on a slow afternoon, which was something he told his assistant was a courtesy call but was, in truth, the beginning of an adjustment. The laundromat was warm and smelled of soap and stories. Amaya's mother, holding a folded towel, watched him like someone watching a weather change. The principal apologized without theater. He spoke about support and funding and how the school could do better. He listened to the people he had once dismissed. Years later, the principal would tell a different kind of joke in meetings, one about being careful what you laugh at because sometimes you laugh at the future and it becomes the present. He would keep the note Amaya had left in the practice room where she had written, in a hurried scrawl, "Music first, not applause." He would not erase his old laughter. Instead, he would use it as a folding chair to sit upon when he needed to remember humility. Amaya's legend did not arrive on a single night. Legends accrue like coins in a jar, slowly, quietly, with many hands dropping their change. She played recitals that raised money to keep the practice rooms open longer. She convinced the board to fund scholarships tied to community service rather than neat resumes. She started a small program that taught music in laundromats, community centers, and church basements. Students from other neighborhoods arrived with curiosity and left with new roots. Her name brought people together in ways that marketing never could. Stories gathered around her like footprints gather on fresh pavement. There was the time she fixed a piano with a screwdriver and a prayer because a tuner could not come that week. There was the night she improvised a lullaby for a neighbor's crying baby and in doing so inspired a father to stop drinking for the next month. There was the charity concert that raised enough to install a community piano in the park so anyone could sit and play without asking for permission. Each story was small, and together they made a map of what persistence looks like. People sometimes asked Amaya what she wanted. She would smile and say, "A place where music is not a commodity and children have enough time to learn." She believed in patient work, the kind of change that refuses spectacle for substance. She wanted to teach young players to listen to their towns and to notice that music is often a response to need. Her students learned to perform not for applause but to create an echo that returned to the people who had raised them. The principal watched all of it as if reading a book someone else had recommended. He attended recitals with a humility that had once been conspicuously absent. Sometimes he would sit in the back, hands folded, eyes reverent. He would remember his old joke and wince, not from embarrassment but from a sense of how wrong laughter can be when not tempered by curiosity. He made small policy changes, nudged budgets toward arts, and began a school-wide initiative that asked every student to volunteer in a local program at least once a year. Amaya never allowed the word legend to live on her lips. Legends, she believed, can be heavy. She preferred to think of herself as a persistent question. What does it mean to be heard? The answer, she discovered, had many forms. For some it looked like a scholarship that kept a child in music school. For others it looked like a tune hummed in a hallway that reminded an elderly man of his wife. For the laundromat kids it looked like a door open to a practice room and a teacher who believed in small changes. Years later, when her hair threaded silver at the edges and her hands had learned new languages of tenderness, people would stand in long lines to get a seat at her community concerts. They would come not just to hear her play but to bring their own stories and set them down in a room that knew how to listen. The principal, retired, would sometimes show up with a hat and a shy smile. He would sit and weep quietly when a phrase reminded him of that rainy Thursday when he had laughed and meant nothing. He would clap the loudest because he had learned how to listen. The story of the girl who had been laughed at for thinking she might play piano became more than a cautionary tale. It became a way schools and cities learned to ask better questions of themselves. Are we making places where laughter is informed by compassion? Do we build systems that find the quiet talent before it becomes a crisis? Those questions moved from committee agendas to dinner tables. People realized that talent hides in practical places, laundromats, grocery stores, late-night diners, and that sometimes the best way to nurture it is to leave rooms unlocked and benches warm. One afternoon, a child from the laundromat program asked Amaya if she had ever wanted to quit. She looked at the child and thought of all the times a broken cord became a lesson and all the teachers who had taught her to stay. "No," she said slowly. "I wanted to keep going. That's different." The child nodded as if someone had explained the weather. At the center of that change was a simple truth. When you listen long enough, you hear what you were meant to do. The principal's laughter had been a small bruise in the story, it had not defined the ending. What defined the ending was that a girl with music in her hands turned her city into an audience that listened. People would speak her name like a benediction, soft and grateful, and the city in return learned to keep rooms unlocked at night so talent could come home. In the end, the legend was not a label but a collective memory. It rested in the laundromat's backroom where children practiced scales and in the park where a community piano waited for anyone who needed to remember how to breathe. It lived in the principal's new speeches where, more often than not, he told a story about why we should hear before we laugh. And it lived in Amaya's hands, which never stopped making small, steady music that would not be dismissed. Think ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.